The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer as Katie Morrison's hands moved through the pre-dawn darkness of Oak Creek Memorial Surgical Recovery Ward. 6:37 in the morning. She'd timed her arrival for this exact minute for 8 months now, early enough to avoid the chaos of shift change, late enough that the night crew had already documented their departures. The antiseptic smell wrapped around her like a familiar coat, sharp and sterile and safe in ways she couldn't explain to anyone. Her white coat hung precisely centered on the back of her chair, its hem hitting exactly at the knee, everything about her designed to be forgettable. Unremarkable. Gone. The ward stretched out in perfect rows, 12 beds, 12 monitors, 12 quiet crises waiting to unfold. Katie had learned the rhythm of this place the way she'd once learned the rhythm of a combat zone, by paying attention to things nobody asked her to notice. Blood pressure patterns. Medication timings. The subtle hitch in a patient's breathing that meant trouble for hours before the alarm would sound. She pulled the first chart from the rack, room 403, Mr. Delancey, post-op day 3, recovering from a vascular reconstruction. She read the notes with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 17 years keeping people alive in the worst conditions on Earth. Vitals stable. Medication list cross-referenced. For site checked at 2,100 hours. Everything documented. Everything correct. Everything exactly as it should be. But there was something wrong in the billing codes. Katie's eyes had caught it 3 weeks ago during a routine chart review, a specialist consultation that didn't match the procedure, a code for a trauma surgeon that shouldn't have been present during routine post-op care. At first she'd thought it was a clerical error. But then another chart. Then another. Always the same pattern. Always subtle. Always there if you knew how to look. She'd kept the observations to herself, written nothing down in places where words could be found, simply filed them away in the architecture of her perfect memory, the same memory that had let her coordinate trauma response during the bloodiest 31 days of the Sangin deployment. 31 days. 218 casualties. 16 deaths that still woke her at 3 in the morning. She was adjusting the saline drip for Mrs. Chen in room 405 when Dr. Hargrove arrived for morning rounds. His shoes were expensive, Italian leather that clicked against the tile floor like a countdown timer. The sound made something in Katie's chest tighten. She didn't look up. She never looked up. That was the whole point of disappearing. You became part of the furniture. Part of the wallpaper. Part of the silence that nobody paid attention to. Morrison. His voice arrived before his body, all confidence and edge. For placement for 402. 20 minutes ago. Katie's voice came out soft, deferential, a voice that had learned how to take up as little space as possible. Peripheral line. 18 gauge. Placed on first attempt. She said it matter-of-fact, without pride, without anything that might draw attention. But she could feel his eyes on her and she knew, the way you know dangerous things when you've spent your entire adult life around them, that he was watching something specific. The movement of her hands. The confidence in her technique. The way she'd slid that needle through the skin and into the vein with the kind of precision that only comes from doing it thousands of times under the worst possible circumstances. First attempt. Hargrove smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator noting the location of prey. That's impressive for floor staff. Katie said nothing. She moved to the next patient, her motion smooth and practiced and deliberately unremarkable. But she was acutely aware of him watching, aware of the way his eyes tracked the surgical grace in movements that should have belonged to someone with a medical degree hanging on a wall somewhere. She'd learned to hide it better over the months, had learned to move like a regular nurse, slower and less precise. But when a patient was in front of her, when there was a body that needed help, muscle memory always won. 17 years of muscle memory. 17 years of hands that had stitched wounds that should have killed men. Hands that had held organs in place while helicopters screamed towards safe landing zones. Those hands didn't know how to move slowly. Hargrove's rounds continued, his voice smooth and authoritative as he reviewed each patient. He was good at this part. Genuinely good. His medical knowledge was sharp, his decisions sound, his bedside manner perfectly calibrated to make patients feel cared for and families feel reassured. Katie had realized weeks ago that this was what made him dangerous. He wasn't incompetent. He was competent enough to convince everyone that his darker actions were impossible. Competent people didn't commit fraud. Competent people didn't steal from hospitals and insurance companies. Competent people didn't prey on vulnerable patients and their families. Competent people did, actually. Katie had learned that lesson in ways she'd never wanted to learn it. By 9:15, she was in the medical records room, ostensibly pulling charts for the day's discharge summaries. The room was climate-controlled and windowless, rows of filing cabinets organized by date and patient ID. It was also one of the few places in the hospital where she could spend time without anyone asking questions. She pulled for charts from the last 3 weeks, all Dr. Hargrove's patients. All with the same billing anomaly. All with specialist codes that didn't align with the actual procedures performed. She photographed each page with her phone, her hand steady, her movements efficient. This wasn't about getting him in trouble. This was about documentation. This was about evidence. This was about the habit of observation that had kept her alive through 3 tours of duty and wasn't going to change just because she'd traded combat boots for white nursing shoes. The Marine General's admission alert came through at 10:43, routing to the recovery ward. Room for 87. Cardiac pre-op consultation. 72-year-old male. Katie read the name and felt something shift in her chest, a tectonic movement of old earth. General Marcus Whitfield. The name meant nothing to anyone else in this hospital. To Katie Morrison, it meant everything. It meant Sangin. It meant the commander of her son's father. It meant 17 years of carefully constructed distance about to collapse like a building with its load-bearing walls removed. She stood in the medical records room, surrounded by filing cabinets and the hum of fluorescent lights, and let herself breathe through the panic the way she'd learned to breathe through everything. In through the nose. For count. Hold. Out through the mouth. 7 count. Again. Again. The PTSD wasn't a metaphor for Katie. It was a living thing, a passenger in her body that sometimes woke up screaming. She'd tried the VA hospital 3 times. The noise of other damaged people, the smell of their desperation, the mirrors of her own wounds reflected in their eyes, it had made everything worse. So she'd chosen instead to disappear into this job, into the anonymity of a hospital where no one knew what she'd been, where her hands could help people without anyone asking where she'd learned to move like that. But now the general was coming to room for 87, and he would recognize her if he saw her, and worse, he would know exactly what she'd been running from. Katie checked herself in the small mirror above the sink in the medical records room. The woman looking back was a stranger. Her hair was shorter than it had been during her Navy years, pulled back in a severe bun that added a decade to her face. She wore no makeup. Her scrubs were 2 sizes larger than she actually needed them to be, deliberately obscuring the muscle definition that came from 17 years of physical conditioning and the kind of strength that only came from pulling bodies out of burning vehicles. She looked tired. She looked defeated. She looked like nobody that a Marine general would remember from a forward operating base in the Helmand province. She looked like a ghost. The truth was that Katie had been walking through the world as a ghost for 8 months. A phantom nurse. A shadow person. She'd taken a temp agency position under partial credentials, providing just enough background to pass basic screening but not enough to trigger any serious investigation into her military service record. Her paperwork listed her as a licensed practical nurse with 3 years of community college experience. No mention of field medicine. No mention of combat trauma response coordination. No mention of the unit patch that was currently sewn into the lining of her white coat with the kind of precise stitching that only came from doing it under fire, when shrapnel was still falling and you had to keep your hand steady because lives depended on it. The patch was from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, her son's father's unit. Dark Horse, they'd called themselves. She'd sewn it into her coat lining the day she'd left her active duty service, a private talisman, a reminder of who she'd been before the PTSD had made her realize she couldn't do it anymore. Before the nightmares had become more real than waking. Before the hypervigilance had made her hear explosions in car backfires and see muzzle flashes in the reflection of hospital lighting. She pulled her coat from the medical records room chair and checked the inside lining. The patch was there, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Just a small rectangle of faded cloth, the Dark Horse insignia barely visible anymore from years of being pressed against her skin. She touched it once, the way she did every morning, a ritual older than any faith, and then she pushed the drawer of the filing cabinet shut with a soft click. General Marcus Whitfield was coming to room for 87, and Katie Morrison needed to decide whether to be present for his arrival or whether to request a shift swap that would take her out of the surgical recovery ward for the next 72 hours. Both options felt like running. Both options felt like the coward's choice. Both options felt exactly like who she'd become, a woman so terrified of being recognized for what she'd been that she'd chosen invisibility over existence. She was still standing in that climate-controlled room, surrounded by filing cabinets and the hum of machinery, when the intercom crackled to life, incoming admission, room for 87, priority cardiac consult. Bed ready in surgical recovery, please. Katie closed her eyes. The helicopter sounds came first, the way they always did when she was about to make a decision that mattered. The rotor wash of the UH-60M Black Hawk that used to bring the wounded screaming into the field hospitals. The same sound that lived in her bones and had never quite left, even after 8 months of pretending to be someone else. She picked up her coat and headed toward room for 87. The physician's lounge at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of recirculated air that had been breathing the same recycled oxygen since 6 that morning. Dr. Hargrove stood in the center of the room during morning rounds, his voice pitched loud enough to carry across the assembled attendings and residents, his posture the casual confidence of a man who'd never been contradicted in a professional setting. "Gentlemen, I'll bet anyone here $50 that our timid little floor nurse, Morrison, the one who jumps at loud noises, quits within a week," he said, his smile sharp as a scalpel. "She's got that deer-in-headlights quality that doesn't last in real medicine." Laughter rippled through the group, the kind of automatic response that came from men who'd learned long ago that disagreeing with Hargrove cost more than agreement was worth. Katie passed in the hallway outside the lounge, her ears catching every word. Her jaw tightened for exactly 1 second. That was all. No flinch, no flush, no retreat to a supply closet to breathe through the sting. Just a single muscle fiber contracting and releasing, a moment of pressure applied and released like a surgical clamp. She continued toward the third-floor med-surg unit without breaking stride, her badge clipped to her scrubs catching the fluorescent overhead light as she moved. The bet was already being calculated in the lounge behind her, odds being adjusted, side wagers being placed. She could have turned around. Could have said something sharp and measured that would have made them all go quiet. Instead, she did something far more dangerous, she did nothing at all. The cafeteria that afternoon was packed during the lunch rush, every table occupied, the air thick with the smell of industrial chicken and something that had been steamed until it surrendered. Katie sat alone near the east window, a habit she'd developed in 8 months of keeping her head down and her past buried. Her lunch tray held the careful selections of someone eating out of obligation rather than appetite, a salad with no dressing, grilled chicken, rice. She'd learned long ago that control started with the smallest choices, that discipline was a habit you built in the quiet moments before everything went loud. Dr. Hargrove approached her table carrying his tray with the casual trajectory of a man moving toward inevitable victory. His path seemed unplanned until the precise moment his elbow struck the edge of her lunch tray with the kind of contact that required exact measurement. Soup splashed across the tile in a golden arc, silverware clattered like shell casings on concrete. The cafeteria went dead silent. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Hargrove said, his voice dripping with the false concern of a man performing empathy for an audience. He pulled a patient file from under his arm, deliberate, calculated, rehearsed, and tossed it at her feet. Papers scattered across the spilled soup, absorbed the golden liquid, began to curl at the edges. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Since you're already down there." The entire cafeteria watched. 47 people, Katie would later learn from the incident report she never filed. 47 witnesses to a moment designed to break her. Hargrove's expression was the look of a man absolutely certain of the outcome, the confidence of someone who'd tried this particular move on 12 other women over his career and watched it work every single time. His presence in the room had weight, the kind that came from institutional power and the knowledge that nobody would contradict him. Katie took one measured breath. Let the silence stretch. A single tear escaped from her right eye, not a break in her composure but something else, something Hargrove misread as fear. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact as she stood. Her voice came out like still water, the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. I've picked up better men than you off killing floors, Doctor, she said quietly. This is nothing. 14 words. 14 words that hung in the cafeteria air like a question nobody could answer. The room held its breath. Hargrove's smile didn't falter, but something shifted behind his eyes, the brief flicker of a man recognizing that his expected outcome wasn't materializing. Katie collected the papers with deliberate care, each movement controlled and precise, her hands absolutely steady as she stacked them on her tray. She walked out of the cafeteria with her head level, not defiant but not bowed either, and the silence followed her all the way through the double doors. What Katie couldn't tell anyone, not the nursing supervisor, not the colleagues who whispered about whether she'd actually have the courage to report it, certainly not her 16-year-old son waiting in their small apartment 6 miles away in Hillcrest, was that the Marine General in room for 87 awaiting a cardiac consult was the same officer who'd commanded her son's father in Sangin. She'd recognized the name on the chart the moment she pulled it that morning, General Marcus Webb, 2nd Marine Division. Her hands had shaken so badly she dropped the clipboard, a reaction Hargrove had witnessed from the hallway and carefully filed away as additional evidence of her instability, more ammunition for whatever he was building. The General's presence at Oak Creek Memorial was supposed to be routine. 58-year-old retired Marine, presenting with exertional chest pain, admitted for cardiac workup and possible intervention. Standard protocol, standard admission, standard life in a teaching hospital. Except that in 2011, when her son's father, Captain James Morrison, had rolled a Humvee over a buried IED in Helmand Province, General Webb had been his commanding officer. The Marines had shown up at her apartment in dress blues and she'd known before they'd opened their mouths. The photograph she'd kept from that era, James in desert camouflage, the general shaking his hand at a deployment ceremony, the Marine flag that had draped the coffin, were all locked in the same trunk she'd buried deeper into her apartment closet the day she'd applied for nursing school and decided to become invisible. Katie had taken this anonymous nursing position at Oak Creek Memorial specifically to escape the PTSD that had made her walk away from 17 years as a decorated Navy corpsman. She'd chosen a hospital deliberately removed from any major military base, used only her basic RN credentials on the application, told no one about Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. The name on her scrubs was just Morrison, no rank, no history, no weight of the things she'd held together on blood-sticky operating tables in forward operating bases that no longer existed on military maps. She'd been so careful about the distance she'd created, so meticulous about the boundaries she'd drawn. And now the ghost himself was 2 floors above her, waiting for an echocardiogram, and she had no choice but to carry out the job that had given her anonymity while simultaneously threatening to shatter it. Dr. Hargrove, meanwhile, began his strategic escalation with the precision of a man who'd learned that direct intimidation worked only on people who still believed in rules. He made a phone call to the hospital's temp agency the following morning, his voice steady and concerned as he questioned Katie's references, suggesting gaps in her employment history that certainly warranted investigation. Wasn't it best to be thorough with staff credentialing? He contacted 2 board members, men who owed him favors from previous consulting arrangements, and planted seeds about a nurse whose psychological issues posed potential liability risks to the hospital. He brought in an outside hospital investigator, a former colleague from his residency program who understood the arrangement perfectly well. The investigator began appearing during shifts, observing medication rounds, reviewing charts, asking questions with the particular tone of someone who already knew the answers and was simply confirming them. Katie noticed everything. The nursing supervisor observing her more closely during medication passes, watching her hands for any tremor, any sign of the weakness Hargrove had suggested. The unexpected credential review that showed up on her employment file, flagged and pending verification. The way conversation stopped when she entered the break room, the quick pivots to neutral topics, the subtle withdrawal that came from people who'd learned not to associate with someone marked for exit. She was being isolated with systematic precision, a process designed to separate her from allies before the real move came. She'd seen it before, in different contexts, in different uniforms. The goal was always the same: make the target invisible so that when she disappeared, no one would notice. Her rock bottom came on a Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock, when she found herself sitting in the VA hospital waiting room as a patient rather than a provider. She had a PTSD evaluation appointment scheduled, the one she'd finally admitted she needed after 8 months of insomnia and hypervigilance and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from pretending to be someone you weren't. She sat among veterans she recognized from previous deployments, their faces turning toward her with confused recognition, their eyes asking the question their mouths didn't dare voice. The waiting room smelled like floor wax and old coffee and something that might have been hope or desperation or the blurred line between the two. A captain she'd treated in Kandahar 3 deployments ago gave her a nod. She looked away. That evening, she stood in her apartment with her navy trunk open on her bed, the metal corners sharp enough to draw blood, and she'd already packed her credentials and half her clothes when her son had asked the question that broke something open in her: "Where are we going this time, Mom?" She had no answer for him. She'd run for 3 years and it hadn't fixed anything. It had just delayed it. The PTSD didn't get better with distance, it just learned to follow you more quietly, settling into your bones like cold that never quite warmed up. She looked at her son's face and realized that she'd brought him to San Diego to escape and then spent 8 months teaching him to disappear as well, to shrink himself, to keep his voice down and his head bowed and his mother's secrets locked behind his teeth. She closed the trunk without finishing the packing. The next morning, she arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 6:30, 20 minutes before her shift started, and she walked past the physician's lounge without looking in. The bet that had been placed was worth nothing now. She had no intention of quitting. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Hargrove had no idea that the woman he'd knocked lunch trays onto the tile to frighten away was standing in the same hospital as the commanding officer who could undo him completely. Room for 87 held the weight of a secret that could unravel everything. Katie had learned to move around General Webb like a surgeon avoids vital organs, precise, careful, never lingering longer than necessary. 3 days after his admission, his cardiac function had stabilized enough that the morning consult was scheduled for the following day, which meant she had exactly 24 hours before the attending cardiologist would walk in, look at this man's file, and potentially recognize the name she'd spent 8 months trying to forget. The general's wife had visited twice. His command staff had called. The Marine Corps didn't let officers sit idle for long, and neither did institutional memory. Katie changed his dressings with the same mechanical efficiency she brought to every other patient: gloved hands, antiseptic wash, fresh bandaging, but her chest tightened with each interaction. She knew his voice. Knew the cadence of command in his speech patterns. Knew exactly which battalion he'd sent to Sangin in 2009, and which young lieutenant she'd held together with saline and pressure dressings while his radio operator screamed for medevac. Her son's father had been part of that unit. Not under the general's direct command, but close enough that the two worlds she'd worked 17 years to keep separate were now occupying the same hospital wing, separated by drywall and the fragile fiction of her anonymity. Dr. Hargrove had noticed something. She felt his attention like a weight shifting. By day 5 of the general's stay, Katie understood with the clarity of combat training that the physician's public humiliation campaign had evolved into something more calculated and dangerous. The medication error appeared first, a note in the chart claiming she'd administered digoxin at 0.5 milligrams instead of the prescribed 0.25. Katie had never touched the digoxin. Dr. Chen had ordered it, and Katie had watched the 4 pharmacists verify and prepare it. But the chart now showed her initials. Someone had altered the digital log. The charge nurse pulled her aside in the medication bay at shift change, her voice low and careful. "You need to know this is in the system." Hargrove flagged it. "We're not saying anything to administration yet, but Katie, you need to document everything from now on." Katie had nodded without speaking. Documentation wouldn't matter. Hargrove didn't need the medication error to be real. He needed it to exist on paper, to create the foundation for a pattern, to build a case that moved from whispers to paper to termination so methodically that no one could trace it back to him. He was competent in his cruelty, that was what made it lethal. The second fabrication came 4 days later. A patient complaint, filed under Katie's name but in handwriting she recognized as belonging to one of Hargrove's research fellows. The complaint alleged that Katie had refused to answer a call light for a patient in room for 82, resulting in the patient falling when attempting to reach the bathroom alone. Katie had been with the patient in room for 82 at the time the incident supposedly occurred. She'd helped him to the bathroom herself. But the timestamp on the complaint was vague, somewhere between 1400 and 1800 hours on a shift where Katie had documented 6 separate bathroom assistance visits. The complaint made her sound negligent. Careless. The kind of nurse who cuts corners. The kind of nurse who doesn't belong in a hospital. It was a brilliant move because the lie was constructed around enough truth to be plausible. Katie had been at Oak Creek Memorial 8 months. She had documented hundreds of bathroom assists. Somewhere in that volume of work, there was just enough ambiguity that the complaint could not be immediately disproven. It would require her to prove a negative, to show that she had been present when she said she had been present, and in the meantime, the complaint would sit in her personnel file like a stone in a shoe, impossible to ignore but designed to cause pain with every step. By the 3rd week of the General's hospitalization, Katie's personnel file had accumulated for documented incidents, each one layered with just enough professional language that no single complaint seemed career-ending on its own. But together, they created a narrative. A story that the hospital was already beginning to tell about her. She overheard 2 nurses in the supply room discussing whether Katie was having problems at home or if she'd just never been cut out for hospital work. The fluorescent lights above the medication bay seemed to buzz louder during her shifts. The break room felt smaller. She started taking her lunch in her car instead of the staff cafeteria, eating stale sandwiches in the parking lot while rain drummed against the windshield. Hargrove had perfected the art of making her invisible while simultaneously making her the focus of institutional scrutiny. He was building the file that would justify her removal. And Katie understood, with the sickening certainty of someone who'd seen operational planning before, that he was creating a paper trail so thorough that no one would question the decision when it came. The rock bottom arrived on a Tuesday morning when Katie called in sick because she physically could not bring herself to walk through the doors of Oak Creek Memorial. She sat instead in the waiting room of the San Diego VA Hospital in Point Loma, a building she'd sworn she'd never enter again, watching the same men she'd treated in Sangin, older now, worn in different ways, shuffle through the corridors. One of them, a master sergeant with a prosthetic right leg, made eye contact as he passed. He nodded like he recognized something in her. Katie looked away. She'd come to the VA because her hands had begun to shake at work, a tremor that started in her fingertips and radiated up to her shoulders, and she needed to know if it was something medical or something psychological. If it was something that meant her time as a nurse was ending, not because Hargrove was constructing a case against her, but because she was falling apart from the inside out. The clinic wait time was listed as 2 hours. She sat in a plastic chair that stuck slightly when she shifted her weight, the smell of industrial cleaner and antiseptic mixing with something older, the smell of trauma itself, if trauma had a scent. It would be the smell of fear and adrenaline and human suffering compressed into linoleum and fluorescent light. Around her, men and women in various states of recovery waited for appointments. A woman with a service dog. A man in a wheelchair with both legs ending at the knee. A young Marine in dress blues, his neck rigid with the specific tension that came from carrying the weight of recent trauma. Katie watched them and recognized herself in all of them. The hiding. The performance. The careful act of moving through civilian spaces while carrying a soldier's weight. The VA physician, when she finally saw him, asked standard questions. Pain? No. Numbness? Some tingling in the left hand. Sleep? She laughed at that one, a sound like glass breaking. The doctor, who looked like he was maybe 50 and carried himself with the grounded presence of someone who'd also served, didn't push. He ordered a blood panel and asked her why she was really there. Katie found herself telling him about the job, the 8 months of invisibility, the deliberate erasure of her own history. She didn't mention Hargrove or the fabricated incidents. She just said she'd been running from who she was and it wasn't working anymore. The doctor nodded and wrote something in his notes. When he looked back at her, his voice had shifted into something that sounded like a command, even though he was phrasing it as a question. You know what your problem is, Senior Chief. No one had called her that in months. The title landed like an anchor being dropped back into water. Your problem is you think you can hide from yourself. You think if you're quiet enough, small enough, invisible enough, the past won't find you. But the past is like shrapnel. You don't dig it out, it works deeper into the wound. He handed her a piece of paper with the name of a therapist and the phone number for the combat trauma clinic. Call them. Don't call them tomorrow. Call them today. Katie had left the VA waiting room with the piece of paper in her pocket and the certainty that the general in room for 87 would be discharged by week's end, which meant her time at Oak Creek Memorial was measured in days now, not months. Hargrove had 4 documented incidents against her. He would likely add a 5th before the termination meeting. She'd seen this pattern before in different context, the slow methodical destruction of someone through paperwork and procedural precision, the kind of psychological operation that left no visible marks. She'd trained soldiers in how to recognize it during her final deployment. She'd helped identify personnel who were being systematically isolated through institutional sabotage. And now she was living it. The supreme irony was that she'd taken this job specifically to avoid the systems and hierarchies that had consumed her in the Navy. She'd wanted to disappear into the role of a floor nurse, to let the medical hierarchy absorb her into anonymity. Instead, she'd walk directly into someone's crosshairs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding with perfect clarity that General Webb would be discharged within 72 hours, and once he left, the one person in the hospital who might recognize who Katie Morrison actually was, the one person whose presence might short-circuit Hargrove's methodical destruction, would be gone. She drove to work on her next shift with her hand steady on the steering wheel and her mind moving through the problem like a chessboard. She could resign. Walk away from the job and disappear again, this time to another city, another hospital, another year of slow erasure. Or she could see it through. Let Hargrove build his case. Let him think he was pushing her out. And wait. Wait to see if anything changed when the general was stable enough to remember who his floor nurse was. Wait to see if the man who had commanded her son's father in Sangin would recognize the invisible woman in scrubs who'd been documenting his vitals with the precision of someone who'd learned to save lives in conditions where mercy was impossible. The second option was more dangerous. It required her to stay visible long enough for someone to see her. It required her to trust that 17 years of military service would eventually matter more than 8 months of institutional sabotage. It required her to believe that being useful, actually, genuinely useful in the way that mattered, might be enough to undo whatever Hargrove had set in motion. The problem was that Katie had spent her entire life being useful, and it had cost her everything. But as she pulled into the parking lot of Oak Creek Memorial and felt the weight of that unit patch in her jacket lining, the faded Sangin patch she touched every morning before work like a prayer to a god she no longer believed in, she understood that the choice had never really been hers. The choice had been made the moment she accepted a job at this hospital. The choice had been waiting for her in room for 87 all along. The monitor's steady beep fractured into chaos at 11:33 p.m. on a Tuesday. Katie was restocking the post-operative recovery wing when she heard it, not the rhythm, but the absence of one. The alarm screamed in 3-second intervals, each pulse a demand she couldn't ignore. She moved toward room for 87 while the on-call resident, Dr. Marcus Chen, was still pulling up vitals from the nursing station 3 rooms away. General Webb's chest was rigid. His skin had shifted from post-operative pink to a shade that belonged in a morgue. The oxygen saturation monitor read 68 and falling, each number a countdown to a flat line. His mouth opened like a fish pulled from water, gasping for air that wasn't reaching his lungs. "Get me the crash cart," Katie said, already moving. Not a request. Not a question. a command spoken in a voice that had guided 17 medics through ambush fire in Sangin Valley. Dr. Chen arrived breathless, his eyes scanning the monitor, his hands frozen at his sides. He was competent in routine situations. Katie had watched him manage 3 standard post-op recoveries that week. But this wasn't routine. This was a man dying in front of him, and Chen's mind had locked into the paralysis that separates the living from the lost. His chest is rigid, Katie said, already assessing. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, compressing the heart. The kind of thing that killed soldiers on dusty Afghan hillsides. The kind of thing she'd treated while bullets ate through sandbags above her head. She didn't wait for permission. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone who'd spent 17 years keeping people alive when the margin between living and dying measured in seconds. The antiseptic smell of the room sharpened as her pupils dilated. Her breathing slowed. Katie located the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line with her fingertips, the same way she'd done it hundreds of times before. Her hands assembled the 14-gauge catheter with movements that were muscle memory wrapped in muscle. For seconds from decision to preparation. Smooth. Economical. The kind of speed that only came from doing something under conditions that demanded perfection. She prepped the site and performed the needle decompression in one fluid motion. The needle penetrated the chest wall and found the pressurized air pocket. The hiss that followed sounded like God exhaling, compressed air escaping, the sound of a man's life returning to his body. General Webb's oxygen saturation climbed immediately. 84, 88. 91, his chest loosened, the rigidity bleeding away like water through open fingers. He gasped, his eyes fluttering open, and for one crystalline moment, his gaze locked onto Katie's face. Recognition flickered there, not the fog of post-operative sedation, but something deeper. Something that knew. His lips moved, but no words came. Dr. Chen stared at her with, "First call, Martin, it's Hargrove. We need to discuss that RN on my floor, the one I mentioned." "Yes. She's a liability." The conversation lasted 90 seconds. "Second call, Temp Care Solutions, this is David." The voice was bright, cheerful, oblivious. "I'm calling about one of your placement candidates. Katie Morrison, RN. We need to discuss credential verification." Her application listed basic RN licensure, but she performed a procedure tonight that suggests significant undisclosed training. "Yes. I'll wait." The hold music played for 30 seconds. Third call, it's Hargrove. "I need the outside investigator. The one from Stanford Memorial." "Yes, I know it's late. This is urgent. I have a nurse performing procedures outside her scope of practice. It's a liability issue. Can you be here by 0800? By 0530 Wednesday morning, Katie's world had become a legal battlefield. 3 board members whom Hargrove had contacted days earlier now had serious concerns about liability. The temp agency had received formal complaints about credential misrepresentation. An outside investigator named Patricia Okoye was already reviewing the incident, her voice clinical and precise. "Can you walk me through this nurse performing needle decompression without physician supervision?" Dr. Hargrove's power moved like a machine that had been wound up and released. He'd cultivated these relationships carefully, the board members owed him favors, the investigator trusted his judgment, the temp agency wanted to avoid litigation. What he didn't understand was why Katie had access to that knowledge, why her hands moved with that certainty, why a simple floor nurse could perform combat medicine like she was breathing. At 0900 on Wednesday morning, Dr. Hargrove personally delivered the termination notice. He had a security guard escort Katie to her locker, a detail that made staff members turn and stare. Katie cleaned out her locker in silence, placing her personal items in a cardboard box, a water bottle, a small photo of her son at age 12, her employee badge, her name tag. "You're a liability, Morrison," Hargrove said, just loud enough for the hallway to hear. His voice had the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this. "You could have killed that patient with your cowboy heroics. You're not trained for emergency procedures. You're a floor nurse. You overstepped, and people could have died. Katie didn't respond. She sealed the box and lifted it. As she moved past Hargrove's office, his tablet sat open on the desk, unlocked, unattended, visible in the periphery of a moment. The billing codes glowed on the screen in careful spreadsheet columns. Katie's eyes processed them in a single glance: phantom specialist charges for consultations that never occurred, equipment suppliers billing 340% markup with Hargrove's authorization, procedures coded as urgent when they were routine, kickback arrangements hidden in facility maintenance line items. $2.3 million worth of fraud, neat and organized and absolutely criminal. She understood exactly why he needed her gone. She'd been too close to the pattern. She knew the difference between legitimate billing and creative fiction. A few more weeks of her meticulous chart reviews, and she would have had enough evidence to go to hospital administration. She would have ended his career. So he'd ended hers first. Katie went home to the small apartment in Ocean Beach where she and her son lived. She pushed her navy trunk deeper into the closet, farther into the darkness, willing it to disappear completely. She didn't unpack it. She didn't open it. She just pushed it down next to winter coats she never wore and boxes of memories that didn't belong to this life anymore. That night, she told her son she'd find work somewhere else, somewhere farther away, somewhere she could finally disappear. She didn't tell him why. She didn't tell him about General Webb or Dr. Hargrove or the choice she'd made the moment she accepted a job at this hospital. She didn't tell him that staying hidden had cost her everything: her anonymity, her job, her ability to build a life that didn't have ghosts embedded in it. On Thursday afternoon, at 1,425 hours, Katie returned to Oak Creek Memorial only to clear out the last items from her locker. She was moving through the quiet hallway during lunch shift when her son burst through the emergency entrance. His sneakers squeaked on the polished tile. His hands clutched a shadow box of medals, the wood finish catching the harsh fluorescent light. The medals inside gleamed, ribbons of deep blue and white, bronze stars catching light like promises. "Mom!" His voice cracked, echoing through the lobby loud enough to stop three nurses mid-conversation. "They need to see these, you can't let him win." Katie's breath caught. The world went still. Dr. Hargrove's face went white. Then red. The color change happened in 3 seconds flat, like someone had flipped a switch from fear to rage. He sat in his office with his door locked, his hands moving across his keyboard with the precision of a man trying to stop an avalanche with a tennis racket. The clock on his wall read 11:22 p.m. He had 13 minutes before the night shift change, 13 minutes before the full weight of what Katie Morrison had seen crash down on his career like a building collapse in slow motion. His first call went to Dr. Sterling Hayes, the hospital board's chief financial officer. A man who owed Hargrove a favor, a significant one, involving a billing discrepancy that Hargrove had quietly corrected 3 years ago without asking questions. The phone rang twice. Hayes answered on the second ring, his voice cautious, already knowing this wasn't a social call at midnight. "We have a situation," Hargrove said, his voice steady but his jaw clenched so tight it looked like his face might crack. "Katie Morrison, one of the floor nurses. She's unstable. Erratic. She performed a procedure outside her scope of practice during the general's crisis, and now she's..." He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man walking through a minefield. "She's becoming a liability. A dangerous one." Hayes didn't respond immediately. Hargrove could hear him breathing, calculating, understanding exactly what was being asked of him. 3 board members. That's what Hargrove needed. 3 votes to justify an immediate termination without formal review. 3 people who understood how to make a problem disappear. By 1:15 a.m., Hargrove had his 3 votes. Hayes, board member Patricia Donovan, and hospital administrator Richard Caldwell. The calls had been brief, transactional, the kind of conversations that leave no paper trail because powerful men know how to speak in implications. Patient safety concern. Scope creep. Unstable employee. Code words for, "we need her gone before she sees anything else." The second phase of Hargrove's counterattack came at 6:48 a.m., when the sun was just starting to paint San Diego pink and gold. He called the temp agency where Katie had submitted her initial application under incomplete credentials 3 weeks before she'd been hired by Oak Creek Memorial. The agency director, a woman named Christine Park, answered on the first ring. She worked early. She always did. I need to discuss one of your placements, Hargrove said, his tone carrying the weight of institutional authority. Katie Morrison. She worked here for 8 months under credentials that don't appear to match her actual background. She may have falsified her nursing certifications. It wasn't true. Katie's licenses were legitimate. But truth moves slower than suggestion, and Hargrove understood that a hint of credential fraud would poison the well forever. One phone call from a hospital physician to a temp agency about potential falsification, and suddenly no agency in San Diego would touch Katie's application. No hospital would hire her. She'd be toxic. Unemployable. Christine Park's voice changed. Hargrove could hear the shift, from friendly to defensive. We run extensive background checks, she said carefully. But there was doubt in her voice now. Doubt that would metastasize into investigation, into protecting their own reputation by distancing themselves from her. I'm sure you do, Hargrove said smoothly. But I thought you should know there may be some irregularities before this becomes a larger issue. The third phase was the killing blow. At 7:38 a.m., an outside investigator named David Mercer arrived at Oak Creek Memorial with a leather briefcase and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being paid to destroy people's careers. Mercer was a hospital compliance specialist who'd worked with Hargrove before, 3 years ago, on a previous situation that had also needed to disappear. Hargrove had called in the favor. One phone call, and Mercer had caught a 6:41 a.m. flight from Los Angeles. Mercer spent 40 minutes in Hargrove's office, reviewing the fabricated disciplinary documentation, the false medication error reports, the exaggerated incident logs. He nodded slowly, his expression grave, the expression of a man examining evidence of systemic negligence. This is serious, Mercer said, his voice like a courtroom closing argument. Performing advanced medical procedures without proper credentials, medication errors, scope violations. If this isn't documented and addressed immediately, the hospital could face liability. It was all beautifully orchestrated. Mercer would write his report, the one Hargrove had already outlined for him, recommending immediate termination for patient safety reasons. 3 board members would vote to accept it. The temp agency would blacklist her. And Katie Morrison would simply cease to exist as a healthcare professional. By 8:45 a.m., the termination paperwork was being prepared. Katie didn't know it yet. She was in the surgical recovery ward, checking post-op vitals, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd held lives together under fire. She had no idea that the ground beneath her was about to collapse. At 9:48 a.m., Hargrove found her in the medication room. He stood in the doorway, blocking the exit the way he'd blocked it 100 times before, except this time there was something different in his posture. Something that made the fluorescent lights hum louder, the air pressure change until Katie's chest tightened. "You're done," he said. His voice was flat, final, the kind of voice that doesn't negotiate. Terminated for performing procedures outside your scope of practice. Security will escort you out in 5 minutes. Your badge will be deactivated. Katie didn't flinch. She didn't ask for an explanation. She simply finished logging the medication she'd been holding, set down her pen with deliberate care, and turned to face him. Her eyes were the color of deep water, calm, still, impenetrable. "I understand, doctor," she said. 5 words. That's all she needed. Hargrove tried to read her expression, searching for the fracture point, the moment where she'd break. But there was nothing to break. She was granite. She was the kind of composed that comes from having already survived worse than losing a job. He walked her out personally, a final humiliation, designed to broadcast to the entire hospital that she was being removed. Security flanked them both, making it official, making it public. Whispers followed them down the corridor. Katie kept her eyes forward, her posture perfect, her jaw set like someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't unmake it. The sun was bright when she stepped out of Oak Creek Memorial for the last time. Her badge was already deactivated. Her access was already gone. She was already nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she knew. In the 20 seconds she'd spent looking at Hargrove's terminal during the crisis, while his attention was on the general's chest, on the oxygen readings, on the machinery keeping a dying man alive, she'd seen enough of the billing codes to understand his desperation. The phantom specialist consultations. The inflated procedure codes. The equipment purchase orders with kickback arrangements hidden in the invoice details. She'd recognized the pattern because she'd spent 8 months documenting patterns, piece by piece, wondering why the numbers didn't match the reality of patient care. Hargrove had fired her because she'd saved a life. He destroyed her because she'd proven she was too competent to ignore. And he still didn't understand that she'd already seen enough to end him. Katie went home to the small apartment she shared with her son. She pulled her navy trunk from the back of the closet, the one she'd packed 8 months ago when she'd tried to disappear from her own identity. The faded unit patch was still there, still sewn carefully into the lining of her white coat. She'd been hiding it. Protecting it. Keeping it safe like it was contraband. Now she pushed it deeper. Buried it further. Made it smaller. Because if Hargrove had managed to fire her, if he'd managed to destroy her civilian credentials so completely that no hospital in San Diego would hire her, then disappearing wasn't just an option anymore. It was a necessity. That night, she told her son they'd be leaving. "I'll find something," she said, her voice steady, controlled, hiding the earthquake that was happening inside her chest. "Somewhere farther. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere you don't have to carry this anymore." Her son didn't argue. He was 16, old enough to understand that his mother had been running from something her entire life. He just didn't know what. 3 days passed in silence. Katie cleaned the apartment. She updated her resume, removing every detail that might connect her to her previous identity. She looked at job postings in Portland, Seattle, Boise, anywhere far enough away that the wreckage of Oak Creek Memorial couldn't reach her. And then, on Thursday afternoon at 2:19 p.m., the hospital's front doors burst open and her son walked through carrying something that changed everything. It was a shadow box. Wooden frame, glass front, velvet backing. And inside it, arranged with military precision, were medals. 4 of them. Each one catching the fluorescent light like a bullet catching the sun. Her son's voice cracked as he walked toward the emergency department desk, toward where Katie's paperwork had been filed, toward where anyone who mattered could see him. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison," he said, his voice shaking but not breaking. "She served in the United States Navy. She was a combat medic. She saved lives." He held the shadow box higher. "And everyone here needs to know what she actually is." The room went dead silent. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to stop. Even the monitor beeping paused, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes walking among us. Like this video and comment below. Would you have revealed your identity or stayed hidden?